Evelyn had always believed that a home wasn't just four walls and a roof. It was the little things one nurtured around it. For her, that meant her garden. Her backyard was small compared to some of the sprawling lawns in the neighborhood, but she made every square foot sing with color and life. Rows of marigolds lined the edge like a golden border. A pair of climbing roses twirled up a trellis near her back fence, and a neat patch of vegetables thrived in raised wooden beds that she had built with her late husband years ago. Every morning, just as the sun peeked over the rooftops, Evelyn stepped outside with her watering can. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and blooms, and the quiet was broken only by the chirping of sparrows. She liked to hum to herself as she moved from plant to plant, whispering encouragement the way some people spoke to pets. To her, these weren't just plants. They were companions, memories, and proof that something beautiful could be cultivated with patience. The garden wasn't just her hobby, it was her healing. After her husband passed, Evelyn had spent weeks in silence, drifting through days that felt empty. It was only when she began tending to the soil again, replanting the roses he had once adored, that she found a reason to step outside. Slowly, grief had softened into gratitude. Each bloom was a reminder that love could still exist in small, steady forms. From the street, Evelyn's yard looked modest, tidy, and cheerful. Neighbors often smiled when they passed by, and more than once a child had asked to pick a flower. Evelyn always obliged, kneeling to snip a bloom and watching the delight on their faces. Yet despite the goodwill her garden inspired in many, not everyone saw it that way. At the heart of the neighborhood stood the Homeowners Association, an ever-watchful group of residents tasked with maintaining community standards. Some board members were reasonable, others indifferent, but one figure loomed larger than all the rest: Karen Whitfield. Karen was known for her sharp suits, her clipboard always tucked under her arm, and her unwavering conviction that rules were rules. She patrolled the sidewalks with narrowed eyes, making notes about trash cans left out too long, paint colors that clashed with community palettes, and hedges that dared to grow an inch too high. To her, perfection meant uniformity, and anything that stood out was a problem. Evelyn had always managed to avoid Karen's radar. Her garden was neat, never spilling onto sidewalks or creating mess. She had checked the HOA guidelines before planting and found nothing that prohibited small personal gardens. Still, she sometimes caught Karen glancing toward her yard with pursed lips, as though beauty itself was suspicious if it didn't match the rows of plain grass lawns. Summer arrived. Warm and bright that year, and Evelyn's garden thrived more vibrantly than ever. The roses were in full bloom, their petals soft as velvet, and the tomatoes hung plump and red from their vines. She had even set up a small wooden bench at the edge of the flower bed, painting it a soft sky blue so she could sit with her tea in the evenings. From that spot, she watched butterflies hover lazily and listened to the hum of bees, a private symphony of peace. Her daughter, who lived several states away, called one afternoon with cheerful news. "Mom, I want you to come visit for a whole week. The kids miss you. I'll take time off work, and we'll have a proper family gathering." The invitation filled Evelyn with warmth. She hadn't seen her grandchildren in months, and the thought of hugging them again made her heart flutter. But she hesitated, glancing toward her garden through the window. Who would water the plants? Would they be all right without her? "Mom," her daughter laughed when she mentioned it, "your flowers will survive a week, and the vegetables will be fine if you water them well before you leave." Evelyn smiled softly, realizing she was right. The garden had grown strong. It could withstand a few days without her careful hand. The following week, suitcase packed and house locked, Evelyn made one last circuit of her yard. She watered each bed thoroughly, adjusted the trellis so the roses would keep climbing, and brushed her fingertips along the marigolds as though saying goodbye. Then she sat for a moment on her bench, inhaling the mingled scents of earth and petals. "Take care of yourselves," she whispered with a chuckle, knowing how silly it might sound, yet meaning every word. She left with a light heart, unaware that while she was away, another pair of eyes had been watching. Karen, walking briskly past the yard, paused. She stopped at the edge of the fence, arms folded, gaze fixed on the rows of flowers and the bright painted bench. Her lips pressed thin, disapproval radiating from her like heat. To her, the yard looked cluttered, disorderly, too loud, with color in a street that she preferred uniform and controlled. "It's not in line with standards," she muttered to herself, already reaching for the pen clipped to her clipboard. She scribbled notes furiously, her mind working. Perhaps she could justify its removal under the clause about excessive decorations or non-standard landscaping. Yes, she thought, that might be enough. A sparrow darted across the fence, chirping as if in protest, but Karen didn't flinch. She snapped the clipboard shut with finality and strode away, already imagining the yard stripped clean, the flowers gone, and the bench removed. And as Evelyn's plane soared high above the clouds that evening, her heart light with anticipation. For hugs and laughter, her sanctuary back home stood on the brink of destruction. The week Evelyn spent with her daughter and grandchildren was filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of joy that stayed with her long after the moments passed. She helped her granddaughter bake cookies, sat at the table listening to her grandsons, endless stories about school, and for the first time in months felt as though the heaviness of solitude had lifted from her shoulders. Every night, before bed, she thought of her garden back home. She pictured the marigolds turning their faces toward the sun, the roses slowly opening another layer of petals, and the tomatoes ripening just enough for her to pick when she returned. In her mind, the garden was waiting patiently, as it always did, for her gentle hands to return. She could not have imagined that while she laughed with her family, a different scene was unfolding in her backyard. 2 days after Evelyn had left, Karen put her plan into action. She marched into the HOA office with her clipboard and an air of authority, announcing that Evelyn's yard violated aesthetic uniformity. When another board member asked for clarification, Karen slapped down a printout of vaguely worded rules. Excessive yard ornamentation, non-standard landscaping. Karen read aloud with emphasis. It applies here. The bench, the trellis, even those vegetable beds, they're all non-compliant. Some of the board members exchanged uncertain glances. A few muttered doubts. Evelyn's yard had always been neat after all, but no one directly opposed her. Karen had a way of silencing opposition with sharp looks and sharper words. Within hours, she had arranged for 2 HOA volunteers and a landscaping crew to handle the violation. The following morning, the sound of shovels and scraping wood startled several neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from across the street peeked out her window just in time to see 2 men hauling away Evelyn's sky-blue bench. Another worker tugged at the trellis until it cracked, roses tumbling in a heap like discarded paper. The marigolds were yanked up in bunches, their roots dangling helplessly, and the vegetable beds were pried apart and thrown into a dumpster. "Are you sure you're allowed to do that?" Mrs. Patterson asked nervously, stepping outside. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, supervising like a general at war. "It's within the HOA's right," she said curtly. "The rules are clear. But Evelyn's always kept her garden so tidy," another neighbor murmured from his porch. Karen turned on him sharply. "Rules are rules. If we let one person break them, chaos follows." The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing more. They had all seen what happened. When people challenged Karen, extra fines, letters taped to doors, threats of legal action. So they watched in silence as years of Evelyn's careful work were reduced to barren dirt and broken wood. By the time the crew finished, the yard looked stripped and lifeless, as though no garden had ever existed there at all. The marigolds, the roses, the vegetable beds, gone. Karen surveyed the bare patch of earth with satisfaction. "Much better," she declared before walking away, heels clicking against the pavement. Evelyn had no idea what awaited her when she finally returned home a few days later. Her daughter hugged her tightly at the airport, the children waving goodbye, with sticky cookie-stained fingers. Evelyn's suitcase rattled along behind her as she walked through her front door, humming softly to herself. The house smelled faintly of lavender, just as she'd left it, and everything seemed normal. It wasn't until she stepped into the backyard that the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She froze. Where her roses had climbed in graceful arcs, there was only a splintered trellis lying in the dirt. Where marigolds once bloomed like golden suns, there was nothing but scattered roots and dry soil. The vegetable beds were gone entirely, leaving behind uneven patches of disturbed ground. Even her beloved bench, her husband's gift from years, Ago, was nowhere in sight. For a long moment, Evelyn couldn't breathe. She dropped her suitcase where she stood, the wheels thudding against the ground, and staggered forward as though stepping into a nightmare. Her hands trembled as she knelt, touching the earth where her flowers had been, finding only broken stems and rough emptiness. Her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes. Every plant, every bloom, every memory she had nurtured had been erased in her absence. "Why?" she whispered aloud, her voice breaking. "Why would anyone do this?" She sat there for what felt like hours, tears falling silently onto the dirt. The garden had been more than plants. It had been her therapy, her connection to her husband, her comfort when days felt long and lonely. And now, all of it was gone. The next morning, Evelyn forced herself to walk through the neighborhood, hoping for answers. She passed neighbors who offered sympathetic looks, but avoided her eyes, unwilling to be the first to speak. Finally, Mrs. Patterson from across the street approached her with hesitant steps. I saw what happened," she said quietly. "It was Karen. She brought people here. Said your garden was against HOA rules." Evelyn's eyes widened. "But it wasn't. I checked. There's nothing in the rules about gardens like mine." Mrs. Patterson nodded miserably. "I know. A lot of us know. But no one wanted to get in trouble. You understand?" Evelyn's grief slowly hardened into something else. Resolve. She stood a little straighter, her eyes no longer wet with tears but burning with determination. "This isn't over," she said firmly, her voice steady now. "She had no right to do this, and I'm not going to let it stand." That night, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with the HOA handbook spread in front of her, flipping through the pages. She traced the lines of vague language that Karen had likely twisted to her advantage. None of it specifically banned her garden. None of it gave anyone the right to destroy her property. As the clock ticked past midnight, Evelyn's sorrow gave way to focus. She made notes in the margins, underlined passages, and marked sections that could protect her. The garden might have been destroyed, but she refused to let her husband's memory and her years of care be taken from her so easily. Karen had crossed a line, and Evelyn knew now that the fight was only beginning. The morning after Evelyn's heartbreaking discovery, she woke with swollen eyes and a heaviness in her chest. For a moment, she lay still, trying to convince herself it had all been a bad dream. But when she drew back the curtain and looked outside, reality struck again. Her once vibrant garden was gone, replaced by nothing more than churned-up dirt and scraps of wood. She pressed a hand to the glass. "Not again," she whispered, as though saying it might undo what had been done. But words couldn't bring back roses, couldn't restore the marigolds, couldn't rebuild the vegetable beds she had loved for years. And yet, beneath the ache, another emotion grew stronger: anger. She had been quiet, respectful, and careful about following rules since the day she moved into the neighborhood. If the HOA thought they could take her peace without reason, they were wrong. The next week, Evelyn walked into the HOA meeting with a folder of papers clutched against her chest. The community hall buzzed with the usual chatter, residents exchanging pleasantries, board members flipping through their agendas. At the center of it all sat Karen, her posture upright, lips pressed, in a self-satisfied smile, as if she were already in control of the outcome. When Evelyn's turn came to speak, she rose from her chair and steadied her voice. "I came home from visiting my family to find my garden destroyed," she said. "Roses, marigolds, vegetable beds, all ripped out. Who authorized this?" The room quieted. A few heads turned toward Karen. Karen adjusted her glasses with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Lane," she said smoothly, "your yard was in violation of HOA landscaping standards. The board took appropriate action." "That's not true," Evelyn replied, her voice firmer now. She opened her folder and held up the handbook. "I've read every page of this document. There is nothing that prohibits personal gardens. My yard was neat and well kept. You had no right to destroy it." Karen smirked faintly. Clause 14.2, Yard Uniformity. It clearly states that all landscaping must remain consistent with the community's aesthetic. Evelyn flipped to the section already marked with a tab. She read it aloud. "Residents are expected to maintain yards in a clean and orderly fashion. That doesn't say anything about banning flowers or vegetables. My garden was both clean and orderly." Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. A couple of residents murmured their agreement. Karen's smile faltered, but only for a second. "The intent of the rule is uniformity," she said crisply. "Your garden disrupted that." Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to shout, to demand how roses and tomatoes could possibly disrupt anything, but she forced herself to remain calm. Instead, she said, "Then show me the rule. Show me the exact line that gave you permission to take my property without notice." The room was silent. Karen's face stiffened. "Moving on," Karen said sharply, banging her gavel. "We have other agenda items to address." Evelyn sat down, her hands trembling with frustration. The board had brushed her off, but she noticed something important. Doubt flickered across a few faces. Karen hadn't convinced everyone, and if the HOA wouldn't listen, perhaps someone else would. That evening, Evelyn returned home and placed the handbook on her kitchen table. She brewed a cup of tea but barely touched it, her eyes scanning the pages again and again. The language was vague, intentionally so, but nowhere did it give Karen the authority to destroy personal property. Her mind turned over and over the memory of Karen's smirk, the gavel slamming, the way her voice dismissed Evelyn like a nuisance. Evelyn's grief hardened into determination. She wasn't powerless. She just needed to know where to look. She opened her laptop and began searching for state housing laws, her fingers trembling with both nerves and hope. Hours passed as she clicked through legal websites, homeowner rights articles, and community forums. At first, the words blurred together, legal jargon and case references, but slowly, clarity emerged, and then she found it. A section of state housing law, written in clear terms, declared that homeowners had the right to maintain reasonable, personal gardens on their property. It went further. Homeowners associations could not prohibit or remove them without due process and explicit evidence of hazard. Evelyn read it 3 times, her heart racing faster with every pass. Not only had Karen acted without authority, but she had violated state law by doing so. Evelyn sat back in her chair, pressing a hand over her mouth as relief and disbelief washed over her. She had been right all along. The next morning, Evelyn took a walk through the neighborhood. She carried a small notepad and quietly spoke to residents she trusted. One by one, stories began to surface. Mr. Jenkins told her about being fined for leaving his trash can out for too many hours. A young couple admitted they'd received warning letters for their holiday decorations. Mrs. Patterson confessed she had once been threatened with a lien over a bird feeder, and in every story one name appeared again and again: Karen. By the time Evelyn returned home, her notepad was filled. Karen had been ruling with intimidation for years, twisting vague rules into weapons. But people had simply been too afraid to stand up to her. Evelyn looked at her notes, then at the printout of the state law she had taped to her fridge. For the first time since her garden had been destroyed, she felt the spark of hope. "This isn't just about me anymore," she whispered. "It's about all of us." That evening, Evelyn sat at her desk and wrote a formal complaint to the State Housing Department. She included photos of her destroyed yard, copies of the HOA handbook, and a detailed explanation of what had happened. She cited the exact law Karen had broken, her words steady and precise. When she sealed the envelope, she felt her hands steady for the first time in days. She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was fighting back. Far across the neighborhood, Karen sat in her own kitchen, sipping coffee while flipping through her paperwork. She smiled faintly, already planning her next round of inspections. She had no idea that Evelyn's letter was already on its way to the state office, or that her reign of unchecked power was about to crack. The days following Evelyn's complaint submission were filled with a strange mixture of nerves and resolve. Every morning she checked her mailbox, half expecting some kind of response from the state, though she knew such things took time. The meantime, she focused on gathering strength, not just for herself, but for her neighbors who had whispered their own frustrations to her. For the first time in years, Evelyn began to feel less alone. At the next HOA meeting, she walked in, with her shoulders straight and her notes tucked neatly in a folder. The room was more crowded than usual. Word of her destroyed garden had spread through the neighborhood, and residents who rarely attended were curious to hear what would happen. Karen sat at the head of the table, gavel resting by her hand, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She looked calm, too calm, as if she still believed she was untouchable. When the agenda reached community concerns, Evelyn rose from her seat. She held the folder firmly, steadying herself, before speaking. "My name is Evelyn Lane," she began, "and I am here again to address the destruction of my garden." Karen sighed audibly. "Mrs. Lane, we've already discussed this matter." "No," Evelyn interrupted, her voice steady but sharp. "You dismissed me. There's a difference." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she gestured with her hand. "Proceed, then." Evelyn opened her folder and pulled out several pages. "I've reviewed our HOA handbook again, and I've also reviewed state housing laws. According to Section 22.4b of the state code, homeowners have the right to maintain reasonable personal gardens. Furthermore, no HOA may destroy personal property without due process and clear evidence of hazard. You violated that law when you ordered my garden removed." The room was silent. Evelyn's words carried the weight of truth, and several board members leaned forward in surprise. Karen stiffened. "You're misinterpreting the statute. Our rules are clear. Uniformity must be maintained." "Show me the rule," Evelyn said firmly, locking eyes with her. "Show me the exact line that allowed you to remove my property." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. From the back of the room, a resident spoke up. "She's right. My nephew's a lawyer. I checked the same law. HOAs can't do what you did." Another resident chimed in. "Yeah, Karen, you've been stretching the rules for years. About time someone said something." The murmurs grew, louder, a tide of voices rising in support. Evelyn stood tall, not shouting, not angry, just resolute. Karen slammed the gavel against the table. "Order! This meeting will not devolve into chaos." But it was too late. The balance in the room had shifted. For the first time, people weren't silent. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Evelyn outside the hall. "You were brave in there," one man said, shaking his head. "I wish I'd spoken up years ago." Mrs. Patterson touched Evelyn's arm gently. "We're behind you, dear. Karen's gone too far this time." Evelyn smiled faintly, gratitude warming her heart. "It's not just about me anymore. We deserve better." That night, Evelyn felt a quiet strength settle inside her. She had spoken the truth, and people had heard it. Karen wasn't invincible. Meanwhile, Karen sat in her home office, fuming. She shuffled through papers, searching for some clause, some loophole that could justify her actions. But the handbook was vague at best, and she knew it. She muttered under her breath, "That woman thinks she can embarrass me? She'll regret it." Karen prided herself on her control. For years, people had obeyed out of fear of fines, threats, or paperwork. But now, cracks were forming. Still, she reassured herself that Evelyn's complaint would go nowhere. The state didn't waste time on small neighborhood disputes. At worst, she'd get a warning, easily brushed aside, or so she thought. A week later, Evelyn returned from a morning walk to find an envelope in her mailbox. The return address bore the official seal of the State Department of Housing and Community Affairs. Her heart raced as she tore it open. Inside was a letter acknowledging her complaint and confirming that an investigation had begun. Copies had been sent to the HOA board for review. Evelyn read the words twice, her hands trembling with relief. This wasn't just hope anymore. It was action. Across the neighborhood, Karen also found an envelope in her mailbox that morning. She carried it inside casually, sipping her coffee, expecting another utility bill or HOA notice. But when she tore it open and saw the state seal at the top, her hand froze. Her eyes scanned the page, and the color drained from her face. Notice of violation and pending investigation. The words seemed to leap from the page, accusing her directly. The letter listed Evelyn's complaint, cited the state statute, and warned that fines could be issued if the allegations were confirmed. Karen sank into her chair, the paper trembling in her hand. Her coffee cup wobbled on the edge of the desk. Forgotten. For the first time, her confidence cracked. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Word spread quickly. Karen had been hit with a state notice. Residents who had once tiptoed around her authority now exchanged knowing glances and quiet smiles. Evelyn, though still grieving her lost garden, felt something stir inside her chest. It wasn't joy exactly, not yet, but it was hope. She knew. This was only the beginning of the battle, and she was ready. The weeks that followed were thick with anticipation. Evelyn carried on her days as best she could, watering the bare soil out of habit, trimming the little grass that remained, and sitting in her now empty yard with a book. Though the loss of her flowers still ached in her chest, she found herself holding tighter to something else, the knowledge that the state was watching. Each trip to the mailbox sent her heart racing. Neighbors, too, had grown restless, their conversations shifting from casual greetings to hushed whispers of, "Have you heard anything?" and "Do you think they'll actually fine the HOA?" Karen, however, tried to maintain her usual air of authority. She strutted through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, but there was a strain in her posture now. She avoided Evelyn's eyes. She no longer stopped to lecture people about their hedges or garbage cans. She smiled too brightly at meetings, as though overcompensating, but underneath everyone sensed it. She was nervous. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea when she saw the envelope in her mailbox, again stamped with the seal of the State Department of Housing and Community Affairs. She rose slowly, heart hammering in her chest. The paper was thick, the lettering bold. When she unfolded it, her eyes locked onto the words, "Notice of violation confirmed. Monetary penalty imposed." The HOA had been found in breach of state housing law. For the unlawful removal of Evelyn's garden, they were fined thousands of dollars. The letter went on to explain that if restitution wasn't paid, further legal action could follow. Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth, tears springing into her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. Justice, at long last, was real and tangible in her hands. Across the neighborhood, Karen was having a very different morning. She tore open her envelope and scanned the words, her breath catching. She read the fine amount twice, as though her eyes must be deceiving her. Thousands of dollars to be taken directly from the HOA's budget. Her hand shook as she set the paper down. No, 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 she whispered, pacing the room. If the HOA's budget was drained, the board would demand answers. Dues would rise, residents would be furious, and all of it would point back to her decision. For the first time in years, Karen felt cornered. The news spread like wildfire. By noon, residents gathered in small knots along the sidewalks, papers in hand, discussing the penalty in incredulous tones. Some were angry about the money being taken from community funds. Others were amused to see Karen finally facing consequences. I always knew she'd pushed too far, muttered Mr. Jenkins, waving the letter in the air. Well, now she's costing us money out of our own pockets. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. It's disgraceful. Evelyn's garden was beautiful. Now Karen's mistake is draining the whole neighborhood. By evening, Evelyn's phone rang nonstop. Neighbors calling to offer sympathy, to vent, to ask what came next. For years, many had stayed silent out of fear. But now, that fear had cracked. The following HOA meeting was unlike any other. The community hall overflowed with residents, their voices buzzing with anger and anticipation. Evelyn arrived quietly, sitting in the middle rows, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Karen sat at the head of the table, pale and tense, the gavel resting uselessly by her hand. Her usual confidence had evaporated. Her eyes darted nervously from one angry face to another. When the meeting opened, she tried to speak. As many of you are aware, the HOA has recently received a notice of violation. The room erupted. You mean because you tore up Evelyn's garden? Someone shouted. My dues are going to cover your mistake, another yelled. You've been pushing people around for years, Karen. Now look where it's gotten us. Karen banged the gavel, her voice cracking. Order! I will have order! But the gavel's sharp crack no longer commanded obedience. The residents weren't afraid anymore. Evelyn rose slowly from her chair. The crowd quieted, giving her the floor. I didn't want this, she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the room. I didn't want fines or fights. I just wanted to tend a small garden that brought me peace. She paused, looking around at the faces of her neighbors. But this wasn't just about me. It's about all of us, about being treated fairly, about not living in fear of one person's power. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken agreement. Karen's face flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You think you're some kind of hero, Evelyn? You've cost this community money. Evelyn turned to her calmly. No, Karen. You cost this community money by breaking the law. The room erupted again, this time with clapping and shouts of support. By the end of the meeting, a motion was made to hold a special election for new HOA leadership. Several board members, unwilling to go down with Karen, quickly agreed. The tide had turned, and Karen's once iron grip was slipping fast. Evelyn walked home under the glow of the streetlights, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. She had not won completely, not yet, but the fine had been more than punishment. It had been proof that the law stood on her side and that even the most powerful could be held accountable. She looked at the empty patch of dirt in her yard, no longer with despair, but with something new, anticipation. Her garden would bloom again. Meanwhile, in her own house, Karen sat alone at her desk, the violation notice spread before her. Her hands clenched into fists as the gavel from the meeting echoed in her ears. Not her gavel, but the sound of the crowd, their applause for Evelyn. For the first time, Karen understood that she was losing, and she hated it. The fine had changed everything. For years, residents had whispered their frustrations in private, lowering their voices whenever Karen passed by. They had endured her notices, her threats, her constant reminders that she alone maintained order. But the state's violation notice, the heavy fine, and Evelyn's calm defiance had shattered the illusion. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. Evelyn began to notice the change almost immediately. Neighbors who once offered only polite waves now stopped at her porch to talk. Mr. Jenkins brought over a basket of apples, muttering that it was the least he could do. A young mother with 2 toddlers knocked on her door, saying, "You've given us courage, Evelyn. We've all been living under her shadow." Evelyn smiled, though modestly. "I only wanted to protect my garden," she said. "But maybe it's more than that now." She walked through the streets and saw something she hadn't seen in years. People standing taller, speaking more freely. It wasn't defiance for the sake of rebellion. It was relief, as though the neighborhood had finally remembered it belonged to them, not to Karen. The next HOA meeting was the most crowded yet. Folding chairs had to be added in the back, and still people stood along the walls. The hum of voices filled the room, charged with energy. Karen sat at the front of the room, but the authority she once commanded was gone. Her clipboard lay on the table, ignored, and her gavel rested untouched. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes darting nervously toward the residents gathering before her. The meeting began with routine items, but no one cared about the landscaping schedule or the repainting of the community sign. All eyes were on Evelyn when she rose from her seat. She didn't raise her voice, didn't thunder with anger. She spoke the way she always had, steady, clear, heartfelt. "I moved here to find peace," she said. "My garden gave me that. When it was destroyed, I felt powerless. But when I looked at the rules and at the law, I realized I wasn't powerless. None of us are." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Evelyn continued, "For too long, we've been afraid to speak out. We've accepted decisions without question, even when they felt unfair. But this is our community. We deserve fairness, kindness, and respect, not fear." Her words hung in the air, simple yet undeniable. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the board members, Mr. Hall, who had always sat silently at Karen's side, cleared his throat. "Evelyn's right," he said. His voice trembled slightly, but he kept going. "I've served on this board for years, and I've stayed quiet, even when I knew some actions went too far. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Karen acted without the board's full consent when she ordered that garden destroyed. And now the state fine has made it clear she was wrong." Gasps echoed across the room. Karen whipped her head toward him, her face red. "How dare you undermine me?" But Mr. Hall raised his voice, louder now. "No, Karen. How dare you undermine us? You've ruled by fear, twisting rules, silencing voices. We're supposed to serve this neighborhood, not control it." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, louder, until the room thundered with it. Karen banged her gavel, but the sound was drowned out by clapping and cheers. That night, a petition began circulating, signed by dozens of residents, calling for a special election to replace the HOA leadership. By the end of the week, more than half the neighborhood had added their names. Karen tried to push back. She sent sternly worded letters claiming the petition was invalid. She posted notices on doors threatening fines for unauthorized gatherings. But the fear was gone. Residents tore down the notices, laughed at the threats, and kept signing their names. For the first time, Karen was the one being ignored. Through it all, Evelyn remained calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. When neighbors thanked her, she always said, "We did this together," but privately she allowed herself moments of quiet satisfaction. She remembered the first night she sat on her empty garden bench, staring at the barren ground with tears in her eyes, thinking she had lost everything. Now, that same space represented something larger than herself. It had become the spark for change. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, Evelyn sat on her porch while Mrs. Patterson joined her. The older woman took Evelyn's hand gently. "You know, dear, we were all so afraid of her. We thought nothing could be done. But you showed us otherwise. You gave us back our voices." Evelyn smiled softly, squeezing her neighbor's hand. "I only stood up because I had no choice. But I'm glad it's helped others, too." Meanwhile, in her own home, Karen sat alone at her desk, the petitions spread out before her. Dozens of signatures glared back at her, each one a nail in the coffin of her authority. She muttered to herself, flipping through her binder of rules. "Ungrateful, all of them. After everything I've done to keep this place orderly." But deep down, she knew order had never been the issue. Control had been, and now that control was slipping through her fingers faster than she could hold it. The stage was set. The neighborhood, once silent, now stood united. The board was fracturing, residents were demanding change, and the petition for a new election had reached the required threshold. Karen's once unshakable power was crumbling, and Evelyn, who had started this journey with nothing more than a love for her garden, now found herself at the heart of a movement. She looked out at the empty soil of her yard one last time before heading inside. Soon, she thought, soon this ground would bloom again, not just with flowers, but with everything the neighborhood had regained: hope, courage, and freedom. The petition had done its work. Within a month, a special election was announced. Flyers went out across the neighborhood, not with Karen's stern notices, but with cheerful reminders from residents eager for change. For once, people actually looked forward to an HOA meeting. On the night of the election, the community hall was packed wall to wall. Evelyn sat quietly in the back row, her hands folded neatly, watching with calm anticipation. She hadn't run for any position. She had no desire for titles or authority, but she knew this moment mattered. Karen entered last. Her once brisk stride had slowed. Her clipboard was absent, her gavel tucked under her arm like a relic from another age. She glanced around at the sea of unfriendly faces, her lips pressed into a thin line. When the votes were tallied, it was decisive. The residents had spoken. Karen was out. The room erupted in cheers. Neighbors hugged one another, clapped, and even laughed aloud. It wasn't just about new leadership. It was about freedom, relief, and the end of years of tension. Karen stood rigid at the front, her face pale. For a moment, she looked as if she might argue, as if she might declare the election invalid. But the crowd's energy left no room for her bluster. Slowly, silently, she gathered her things and walked out. The door shut behind her, and with it, a chapter of fear finally closed. The following morning, Evelyn awoke to an unusual sound outside her window. Laughter, voices, movement. Curious, she stepped outside and stopped in surprise. Her neighbors were gathered in her yard. Mr. Jenkins, sleeves rolled up, was already turning the soil with a shovel. Mrs. Patterson had brought a flat of colorful flowers. Children dashed about with watering cans. Even the quieter families, the ones who had never spoken much, were there, smiling as they dug, planted, and worked together. Evelyn pressed a hand to her heart. What is all this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We're rebuilding your garden," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. "Together. It's time it bloomed again." Evelyn felt her eyes sting with tears as she joined them. She knelt in the soil beside her neighbors, guiding where roses might thrive best, where lavender could spill over the edges, where sunflowers might stretch toward the sky. Her hands sank into the earth, and for the first time since the garden had been destroyed, she felt peace blooming inside her again. By late afternoon, the once barren patch of dirt had been transformed. Rows of flowers, herbs, and bright blossoms swayed in the breeze. The air was sweet with the mingled scents of lavender, mint, and fresh soil. Evelyn's bench had been polished and returned to its place beneath the shade of the maple tree. The neighbors gathered around to admire their work, smiles lighting every face. "It's even better than before," whispered one child, tugging on her mother's hand. Evelyn sat on the bench, looking at the garden with tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "More beautiful than I ever dreamed." That evening, the neighborhood held a small celebration. Tables were set up with food, children played tag across the lawns, and music drifted from someone's IOB speaker. For the first time in years, it felt like a true community, not just a cluster of houses under rules and surveillance. Evelyn moved through the gathering with quiet joy. Everywhere she went, people thanked her, not just for standing up for her own rights, but for giving them courage to reclaim their voices. "You didn't just bring back a garden," one neighbor said, raising a glass. "You brought back our neighborhood." Karen, meanwhile, remained unseen. Word spread that she had withdrawn, rarely leaving her home. Some pitied her, others felt she had finally received what she'd long deserved. Evelyn, for her part, thought little about her former adversary. She bore no malice. The garden before her was proof enough that life had a way of setting things right. One afternoon, weeks later, Evelyn did see Karen briefly. She was driving past in her car, eyes fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. Their gazes met for only a moment before Karen turned away, her vehicle rolling down the street without pause. Evelyn watched her go, then turned back to her thriving flowers, smiling softly. The past was the past. The future was brighter. As the seasons changed, Evelyn's garden flourished. Bees hummed, butterflies danced, and neighbors often stopped to admire the colors spilling across her yard. Evelyn would sit on her bench, book in hand, listening to the laughter of children playing nearby and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Her garden was no longer just hers. It was a symbol for everyone, a reminder that even when power tries to silence, fairness can grow again. On a golden autumn afternoon, as neighbors gathered in her yard for tea, Evelyn looked around at the smiling faces and felt a warmth that reached deeper than sunlight. She had come to this neighborhood years ago seeking peace. She had lost it for a time, but through struggle, resilience, and the strength of unity, she had found something greater. Not just peace, but belonging. And in the heart of her blooming garden, Evelyn knew this truth. Flowers may be cut down, but they always find a way to grow again.